when it comes to small reforms, right? That like,
Mhm.
are they moving in the right direction or are they not? And I think like there's a little bit of two steps forward, one step back kind of situation that happens in a lot of prison reform. And even saying the word reform, I know annoys a lot of people who are like, it cannot be reformed, remake the shit from the ground up,
Mhm.
replace policing, etc. But I know what's something that's been going on now, and I know you've written on about Rikers Jail in New York, notoriously inhumane. Um, Bill de Blasio did take steps to close it, so it is supposedly on its way to being closed. It hasn't yet, and the solution has been floated to just create 4 or a few more other smaller, like borough-wide jails in New York, as opposed to Rikers. What do you make of that?
I think that when we talk about closing Rikers and just having 4 new jails, what we're saying is we're going to have 4 mini Rikers. I mean, Rikers Island itself started as a reform to all the terrible borough-based jails that were dotted throughout New York City. So in the, I believe it was the 1970s, the city said, okay, no more of these terrible jails that have caused us great shame and, are cesspools of, of indignities. We're going to build this sleek, modern facility on this island. It will be centrally located. We're going to have all of like the best amenities that 1972 can offer. And it very quickly deteriorated into a hellhole, and it has remained a hellhole. So I think what happens is we just keep going back to this model of we need to have jails, as opposed to saying,
Mhm.
how do we decarcerate or decrease the numbers of people going into jails and prisons? How, and that goes back to your question about criminalizing homeless people. What do we do instead of criminalizing homeless people? How do we actually connect them to affordable housing? Well, that might mean shifting money from jails and prisons to building actual housing so that
Yeah.
people can live in them. So it might look like increasing mental health services and decreasing money from the failed solutions of police and jails to do that. And then when you have 4 new jails, you still have the same culture because it's still the same correctional officers. It is still the same bureaucracy that is overseeing these jails and directing these jails that are just going to be in 4 separate places. And what will
Yeah.
happen is if the police continue to arrest and criminalize people, they will say, well, now this is overcrowded. We need a bigger jail,
Right.
than this building we have. So let us build more. So what we're going to see again is the same terrible conditions. So the people there might get a shiny new jail, but they'll still be staffed by many of the same officers that refuse to allow them medical or mental health services, who brutalize them, who refuse to allow them to have any of their dignity or human rights or bodily autonomy. And then we're just going to see it keep growing and growing.
That's a really good point. Um I wanted to also ask you about and talk about like recidivism, which is like the rate at which people recommit crimes after
Mm-hmm.
they've been in prison. You know, a lot of Americans look at, Norway models, right? Norwegian models of imprisonment and all the open spaces and the amount of freedom and there's no life sentences, and it's like, "Oh, how are you going to keep a murderer there? That's terrible." But their recidivism rate is like, I don't know. It's like 8 it's low. It is a low,
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember the exact number. And ours are insane. I think for sure, I mean, I don't, you tell me, but I thought they were like at least over 50%. Um but they're not working also
Mm-hmm.
once people
Yeah.
get out to
Mm-hmm.
actually help folks rehabilitate, reform. And I think there was another really important example. There was no question of that. I'm just monologuing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but one of, this horrible, brutal murder of Christina Yuna Lee in New
Mm-hmm.
York City by a man, a 25-year-old kid who was homeless, who may or may not be mentally ill, and he had been caught a couple times by the police and sort of let go. And to me, and I think to some people, like I'm of two minds. Like my American like propagandized brain says, well, he should have been arrested and put
Mm-hmm.
away. And then my other brain is like, well, fucking the police didn't do that. Like they're not equipped to deal with this person who may not have broken the law in this case, but someone should have been following up with him to make sure he had, like, that he was okay, or that he wasn't going to hurt anybody, or that he wasn't, like, clearly he slipped through the cracks. And the answer isn't send him to jail and that would have, solved it all.
I mean, what we're seeing is that when you talk about Norway, we look at their open prisons and their low recidivism rate, but then we also have to look at the rest of the country where they have a social safety net, where they actually have, you know, better quality of life than
Right.
we do here. So somebody there might have actually been caught earlier as like, oh, there's something going on with you here. You keep getting arrested for petty crimes. You're
Yeah.
like, you know, like doing something weird to the turnstile, to make your
Oh,
Metro card work. Like everything that he'd been arrested for was like relatively petty, but like what's
Yes.
going on here? So you don't want to call for increased incarceration for people who are swiping people in with their Metro cards or messing with the turnstiles or other things like that. And I think
I'm going to
also,
jail immediately. If we're going
yes,
to start incarcerating swipers and
I
jumpers,
know,
I'm
I
going to
know.
jail.
Which, by the way, I just was in New York. Swipers and jumpers, huge.
Yeah.
Like when I was living in New York, I was like, it wasn't that bad, but also it wasn't like whatever $4 for a fucking ride at that
That's the
point.
thing. They keep raising the prices. Listen, I'm against jail except for the people who run the MTA. Like at the very top. Sorry, don't mean to disagree. Just that one guy.
I think that if you ran on that platform, you would probably sweep the mayoral election. Everybody would be like, yes, we all agree. But yeah, so what we see is that, but the criminal legal system isn't set up to figure out what does this man need. It's just like, we're going to punish you for messing up our turnstile. We're going to punish you for swiping people in. We're going to punish you for all of these things. Come back to court another day or be held at Rikers Island, but it doesn't address any of the issues of why did he decide to target this woman? Why did he follow her in? And then looking at the surveillance video, why did nobody else in that building, and you can see that she passed several other people who I assume lived in the building and weren't just randomly there at 4 a.m, be like, hey, who's this weird guy in the building that's following our neighbor up the stairs? We've never seen him before. Like there was nobody that like this rang an alarm bell for. And then the police were called and they took their sweet time opening her door, so
Jeez.
they also could have saved her. And I mean, that police are very good about knocking down people's doors and shooting people in other circumstances. So, but in this circumstance, they decided not to do that. So you can't say that like, oh, they never knock down anybody's door. They never barge in without a warrant or, because they think something else is happening. But in this case, they did not.
I mean, also makes me, it's like thinking about housing in New York. So you want to live in a place with a doorman? Oh, lol. Like who can afford that?
Well,
Anyway,
she lived
it's
in
such a
she lived in a place with a security camera, and that security camera also did not do anything for her.
exactly. No, it's such a tragedy, and you're just like,
Yes.
how can we prevent further things from that, like that, without again criminalizing and locking more people away? One last question, Victoria, which is, I know we're in this moment of we're over the pandemic, but we're not really. And you've covered a lot of COVID and its spread inside of jails and prisons. Can you talk about, has there been any policy change keeping prisoners safer? Has has advocacy worked in this case, or has that window kind of closed? What is the state of COVID and the health of the incarcerated?
I think for a brief moment in 2020, there was a window in which people were more receptive to hearing about letting people out of jail and prison or not sending them there in the first place, because prisons are just a hotbed of COVID. Like imagine living in a dormitory with 32, 42, 75 other people, and you're all 4 feet apart. There's no social
Yeah,
distancing.
it's like saying you got to keep 6 feet distance inside a 5-foot box. It's an impossibility.
Yeah,
It shows
indeed.
such a misunderstanding of like how bad the conditions are to think
Mhm.
that you can make it COVID safe.
Yes. Yes. And so we had this brief window in which jails were not having as many people be in them because police were making fewer arrests, judges weren't remanding them to jail, and then prisons had fewer people because jails weren't sending them to prisons. And then that now we're seeing a rise to pre-pandemic levels of incarceration because people feel like, oh, COVID is over and we're worried about crime, and a lot of the mainstream media has whipped up a lot of fears about crime. I mean, the
Yes.
the killing of Christina Lee was tragic and terrible, And people are scared, but the solution is not sending more people to jails and prisons in the hopes that you will prevent somebody else from doing that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And thinking about, this sort of
Mhm.
pecking order of who gets COVID treatment access and who
Mhm.
gets testing access, you're like, I can't imagine that the tests are, I mean, people are gonna have to like trade cigarettes for a fucking COVID test in jail. Like this is, I feel like that's the world we're headed to, and they're not gonna be like prioritized for the, a booster shot. I
Mhm.
know that it's been even hard to get vaccines in a lot of.
In many prisons, it's
Mhm.
been hard for them to get vaccines, and many people now are not asking for tests because when you test positive in a jail or prison, you're put in solitary confinement. So imagine being in the world's smallest bathroom with absolutely nothing
No.
for 14 days. You're not given medical care. They call it medical isolation, but it's not like anybody comes in and makes sure that you're breathing okay or that
Yeah.
you've got any sort of like medical needs taken care of. One woman said that she told prison staff that she was feeling depressed, and she said not once did mental health staff come and visit her in her isolation cell. So she was saying, I'm feeling depressed. She stopped short of saying that she was feeling suicidal, because then they would take all her clothes off of her and give her a rubber smock so she couldn't harm herself. So she told them that she was feeling depressed,
God.
but she did say, like, I was really, really needing help, and they did not send any mental health staff to come see me. All they did was say, yeah, okay, here's your food tray. Goodbye.
What's going on, Frantifa? If you haven't already, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button. And also, you can become a patron and support the show every single week. Get access to bonus episodes and exclusive merchandise. Patreon.com/Bitchuation Room. Do